Hello, and welcome to Roly Poly Weight Loss. I'm your host, Roly Poly. Welcome to day 32. And it is a Monday, so it is weigh-in day. Okay. Okay. 272.4. Okay. That's going back in the right direction. So I'll take it. Okay. Now on to the topic. Okay, so let's get started. So, last week, I sort of tore apart the diet myth, but now, if you can't trust diets, how can you lose weight? Well, the short answer is to find what works for you. Now, here's the longer answer. As we mentioned before, in their Explained docuseries, Netflix has an episode on why diets fail. In this episode, Marion Nestle, professor of nutrition, lays it out for us. Dietary advice is really simple. You eat fruits and vegetables. You don't eat too much junk food. And you balance caloric intake with the kind of activity level that you have. You try to eat unprocessed foods to the extent that you can. It really isn't any more complicated than that. Now, that is true. Eating healthily is that uncomplicated. But uncomplicated is not the same as easy. If it was, none of us would be fat. WebMD, in their article on obesity and genetics, acknowledges this. Obesity is a very complex disease, and many factors can contribute to it and cause it, including genetics, behavior, and environment. So, as they said, there are a variety of factors that determine your particular situation, and thus how you should approach your eating plan. And unless you look at all those factors, you're not going to find the right lowercase d diet for you. So, what factors influence us? Well, good time for a break. So, the factors vary by source. According to Harvard Health, there are 7 basic factors or subfactors, and these are our calories in and out, genetic influence, exercise, environmental abundance of food, sedentary snacking, and finally, stress, sleep, and similar things. So, environmental abundance of food and sedentary snacking both kind of go into environmental. And we've talked about stress, sleep, etc. before, and also exercise. So we're going to cover the other 5 in upcoming episodes. Now, Healthline also has a list, but they have 10 factors. These are genetics, engineered junk food, food addiction, aggressive marketing, insulin, certain medications, leptin resistance, food availability, sugar, and misinformation. So you can see they kind of are taking 2 different approaches to the subject in the kind of things they list. Now, again, some things we already covered, like medications and diet advertising. We also touched on insulin and leptin resistance in a couple of times, talking about metabolism, medications, that kind of thing. And of course, I'm doing my best to combat misinformation by researching everything I can. But what about the other 6? Well, again, we're going to start covering those now. So, the first one we are starting with today is from both lists, and that is genetics. So, WebMD's article makes note of this factor. Research shows that differences in your genes can lead to weight issues. So, if your parents are obese, you're more likely to be too. But that doesn't mean you will without question. Many people with obesity in their families don't tip the scales. So, they're saying there's the genetic side. But you can't only look at genetics. As we said, there are many factors. One of them is the environmental side. So they continue, obesity can run in families, not because of genetics, but because of habits and environment. Which makes sense. Genetics aside, if your parents are eating a particular kind of diet, you likely will too while growing up. And not only will this impact your weight at the time, but the way you eat, the kind of things you eat once you grow up and move out, will be based on what you learned as a kid. So you can see where some things that you say, oh, that might be genetic because my parents are overweight, that might also be environment. So they're tied pretty closely together, these two. So we're going to discuss genetics today and environment next time. But just keep in mind that they are linked very frequently. So in the Explained episode on Netflix, they also bring up genetics. There's an aspect to our bodies and to dieting that we really can't control, our genes. More than 50% of the variation between people in how heavy they are is due to their genetics. That doesn't mean your weight is determined by your genes, but certain genes make it much more likely that you'll be overweight in a given environment. So they make a very important point here, which is that genetics aren't an instant determiner of our weight. They're a contributor, not the only contributor, as we're exploring this week, but a contributor. And again, they tied into environment. They said the genes make it more likely you'll be overweight in a given environment. If you grew up, let's just say, living at some health spa and only eating like fruits and vegetables and exercising all day and doing yoga and stuff, even if you have obesity genes, you're not likely to be obese because of that environment. So the genes aren't 100%. If you have obesity genes, you will be obese. That's not the case. So just like that old myth about, I have a slow metabolism and that's why I never lose weight. You can't just say, oh, I have genetic, obesity, so I'll always be fat. It's not that simple. We can't just have that easy thing to blame. So, in an episode of BBC docuseries Horizon, which is called Why Are We Getting So Fat?, they also look at genetics. This is popped out of Horizon and put as its kind of its own documentary on Netflix, and I really recommend watching the whole episode. There's some fascinating information and studies. But I'm just going to cover a small portion today, which is the part about genetics. Really, it's all about genetics, but a specific gene is what I'm covering. So, the main thing they get into is, as I said, genetics. They tie it into environment a bit, because, of course, any given factor doesn't stand alone. But in this case, it's a case of the one making the other worse. So Dr. Giles Yeo notes that this is because for so long, our brains were stuck in survival mode. He says, there's a mismatch between a brain that thinks we're still supposed to be putting on energy because we might starve at any point, and an environment which encourages our baser instincts in order to eat more. So our brains are still stuck in hunter-gatherer mode, looking to gather as much food as possible for the least amount of effort. But our modern environment is full of ready-made, high-caloric food that we have to barely exert to get. Heck, with apps like Grubhub, you don't even have to drive to the drive-thru anymore. You can have it delivered. It's kind of insane. I mean, good, but insane. So Dr. Yeo notes, some people seem to be affected by these instincts more than others. They find it particularly hard to resist a temptation of calorie-rich food. So while some people can drive past that Taco Bell and not give it a second glance, some of us have to pull in and get something. Why? In the kind of food-rich environment so many of us live in now, why are some of us so much more affected? Obviously, without the genetics, the environment wouldn't affect us as badly. And without the environment, our genetics wouldn't matter as much. So Dr. Yeo lays it out. Obesity is perceived as really quite a simple problem, right? Eat less, move more. And that is fine, simple physics. The problem, however, is that why people eat more is quite complex. And this is where the genetics comes into play in how it makes us interact with our environment. So one thing I was surprised to learn was that there actually does seem to be a kind of obesity that is purely genetic. Now, this is pretty rare. Like we talked about with metabolism, this is pretty rare. So the odds of any of us actually having this are probably close to zero, but it is a thing. So as Healthline explains, researchers have identified certain rare instances in which obesity seems to be caused solely by genetic mutations. One such rare form of obesity, called monogenetic obesity, appears to be caused by spontaneous mutations in single genes that are involved in appetite control and food intake. Certain genetic syndromes are also linked to obesity, including Prader-Willi and Bardet-Biedl syndromes. So both of those syndromes become apparent in childhood with many other symptoms such as muscle weakness and vision impairment, respectively. So if you've gotten to adulthood without that whole host of symptoms, it's unlikely that you have either Prader-Willi or Bardet-Biedl syndromes. Okay, disclaimer. But, interestingly to note, there actually are some types of obesity they found that are purely caused by genetics. Now, it's far more likely that any genetic influence on your fat levels are of a more subtle variety, as Healthline explains. Another condition, known as common obesity, may also have a genetic link based on evidence from animal models and twin studies. According to HPSH, this form of obesity is believed to be affected by multiple genes rather than a single gene. Common obesity may help explain why some people tend to carry more body fat than others. So you heard before, the other one was called monogenetic obesity, meaning one gene causes it. This is common obesity that is caused or affected by multiple genes. And that's what most people, including Dr. Yo, are talking about is common obesity. This idea is echoed by WebMD in their article. There's one gene that's getting a lot of attention called FTO. Scientists found that people with certain differences in this gene have a 20 to 30% higher chance of obesity, and those differences are pretty common. Dozens of other genes are linked to weight as well. Some, for example, cause people to just naturally store more fat. But it's still unclear exactly how much weight genes really do carry. Are you really destined to be overweight? So obviously, with so many different genes that can be linked to obesity, research is ongoing as to how they all exactly affect us. So Dr. Yo, who actually studies these genes, expands on this. We know that there are over 100 genes that are linked to common obesity. Of these, the one with the largest effect is a gene called fat mass and obesity-related transcript, or FTO. Now, all of us have FTO. Some of us, however, have inherited a slightly different version of FTO, which increases our risk for becoming obese. Half of the population have a version of FTO that contains just one small change. And what this means is that we are 1.5 kilos heavier and 25% more likely to become obese. But roughly 1 in 6 of us are unlucky enough to have 2 small changes, or a double risk variant of FTO. And they are more likely to want to eat more. They are on average 3 kilograms heavier, and critically are 50% more likely to become obese. Side note for my fellow Americans, a kilo is 2.2 pounds. So 1.5 kilos is 3.3 pounds heavier, 3 kilos heavier, 6.5 pounds. Now, that might not seem like a lot, and in fairness, it isn't. You can fluctuate 2.2 pounds day to day just on water retention and going to the bathroom. So, that's not a lot. But the far more impressive, to me, and scary stat is where people with 1 or 2 FTO risk variants are 25 or 50% more likely to become obese. And that's where you're really finding this affecting people. And again, the numbers of people he said half of people have the one risk version of FTO. So half of people are 25% more likely to become obese. And then 1 in 6 of us have the double risk. So, I mean, that's a huge number of people. Now, he does note that you don't eat twice as much as the person next to you. That's not what happens. You're eating 5% more. But 5% more every day of your lives adds up to a huge lot of difference when you actually put it all together. So really think about that. You are eating just a small amount more every day. Comparing plates, it might not even seem like that much more, 5% more. I mean, that's maybe an extra spoonful or something that you might think, well, I eat the same as that other person, but it's a tiny bit more that just adds up and adds up and adds up. And that's the kind of really subtle, insidious thing that you can see some of these genes doing, where the gene doesn't just turn you fat, like the monogenetic obesity, but it just has this subtle, insidious way of just upping your caloric intake or decreasing your exercise or that kind of thing, where it's just making tiny changes that just add up over time. And also, I mean, think about it. What if you live in a fast food dense area, which studies show means you are 45% more likely to become obese? And then you also have a double FTO risk, making you 50% more likely to become obese. I mean, I don't know if that's exactly how this math works, but it seems like that means that we are 95% more likely to become obese, which is almost 100. And that seriously feels like the deck is completely stacked against you. I mean, we talked before about how when people lose weight and then their body completely stacks the deck against them and goes, okay, now you're going to feel hungry all the time, never feel full, always be concerned with looking at food, and we're going to stack the calories on you because we think you're starved. It's that exact kind of why is the universe conspiring against me thing. Okay? I might have a genetic predisposition to become 50% more likely to become obese, and then also if I live in a fast food rich environment, I am environmentally more likely to become obese. What? What is this? But before you completely despair, Dr. Yo gives some more detail and a possible ray of hope. So first, he explains a bit more about FTO risk factors. We now know that these genetic variations have been linked to changes in the brain, which make it less sensitive to appetite hormones released from the gut and fat cells. This, in turn, affects how hungry we feel. So basically, we are slightly fatter than our brains think we are, and we eat slightly more than our brains think we do, because they aren't receiving the hormones properly, which, when you think about it, is very similar to what was happening with people who dieted. So it might be that this is just kind of, instead of a whole new set of problems, this is just a small doubling or a small increase, a small likelihood that we are resistant to these hormones. And then according to another expert that they talked to, it can affect the reward center of your brain. So how you view food. Again, we talked before about you being hyper-aware of food, viewing food as a reward, and how eating food triggers you. So it can change what you like and what you crave. So again, this ties into that yo-yo dieting. Our hormones, metabolism, everything, just the way the chemicals interact in our brain can be completely changed by this. And then are permanently affected afterwards when we try to change things. So we feel hungrier, we feel less full, etc. So Dr. Yo and the other scientists conducted an experiment to see if knowing that you had any FTO risk variants affected how you ate. Since some of the participants had either 1 or 2 FTO risk variants, the team expected these people to prefer the fatty, sugary foods that, again, trigger our reward center, and to eat more of them because, again, they don't get the message that they're full, and they think they eat less than they do. That's typical of an FTO risk person. But so they told them if they had 1 or 2 FTO risk variants or no risk variants. And so they were actually aware of this inclination in themselves. So what they found in this short study was that actually the FTO people, FTO risk people, ate less and or the healthier option because they knew what their brain was tricking them with. So obviously more studies are needed, always, but it seems that just knowing that you're fighting against your biology might make you more conscious of the effects that can have on your choices. So if you know that your brain is lying about how hungry you are, maybe you're more likely to eat less and try to counteract that lie. So this also ties back to when we were talking about weight loss medication. If you're affected by FTO risk factors, then a medication that prompts fullness hormones might help mitigate your genetic lack of them. Alternatively, again, studies are needed. Your brain just might say, nope, I still don't see those hormones. I still am not receiving them. So that weight loss medication might do nothing for you because your brain is just wired to not receive those hormones, whether they come from your gut or come from a chemical medication. I don't know. I could not find a study on this. But it's something to think about. If you have FTO risk variants and you're looking to try medications, be aware that they might fix the problem or they might just be the same as the ones coming from your gut. So of course, this begs the question, can I get a genetic test to see if I have FTO risk level? Yes. Ish. So, I will elaborate. Some ancestry companies, like 23andMe, also offer genetic health tests while they've got your DNA. Unfortunately, to my mind, you can only get this with the Ancestry test, not on its own. So the Ancestry test is $99. The Ancestry test plus genetic health testing is $199. And they don't just sell the genetic health testing part because they want to know your ancestry. So, arg. Specifically, 23andMe does appear to test for FTO, but the sample report on their website doesn't actually list your risk factors. They give this general, pretty, paragraph thing assessing your weight and saying how there are all these different genetic weight-related genes, and you have more of the thin kind or more of the fat kind and whatever. Now, from what I've gathered from other sources, they do also give you the raw data that you can plug into a different website and just get a yes-no on what you have, instead of just their fancy schmancy analysis for you. But I can't find an exact thing on their website that tells you that. But it appears that they do. Not having tried it myself, I do not have the $200 to spare. I would love it if someone who has could clarify if the results actually told you what your FTO risk was, or if you had to go, take that raw data and put it somewhere to get it tested, to get it figured out. Ancestry DNA is only $99 for the ancestry part, and it appears that they also just include a small genetic health panel as part of the $99, but it does not appear to be as detailed as 23andMe, and it's very unclear on their website. It seems to be more focused on the things like whether you go bald or things that affect your appearance. And then there's one line about weight, which appears to be FTO, but I'm not positive. Again, these places are really sketchy on exactly what they do health-wise. So, taking that into consideration, there are also companies that just do health and fitness-related testing, which seems great. That's the part I need. They are more likely to advertise and promote their FTO test and spell out, we do an FTO test, which, great, that's what I wanted to know. New Life Genetics has an FTO test as well as several others, but their website is really glitchy. It's redirecting to a login screen, so you can't actually apply for a test. So I can't find any more details, including costs. Hopefully they get that fixed. It's been that way for about a month now, I think, so we'll see. So the other big one I found is Fitness Genes. Now, they will also charge you $199, just like 23andMe. But they will do genetic tests for you, including FTO and all kinds of other fitness, health, weight, etc. related things. They also offer customized eating and workout plans based on your results, which could be a good place to start for you. And then one fun thing they offer is if you have already gotten a test somewhere else, like 23andMe, you can upload your results and still get their plans for just $49. So this is where I believe you can take the raw data from 23andMe, this is what leads me to believe there is raw data, and plug it in and see, and it'll say, oh yes, this shows you have FTO, double risk variant, we recommend this plan. So that's what leads me to believe that there is raw data for 23andMe. Nothing on their website leads me to believe that, but the Fitness Genes website leads me to believe that it exists. Again, these people are very secretive about exactly what they're doing with your genetics DNA coding, which in itself is a little sketchy to me, but either way, no matter what company you use, you're going to be paying quite a bit, over $100, likely close to $200, to get your genetic test through a company like this, which, again, I don't happen to have lying around right now. So as much as I would like to know if I have any FTO risk, probably not going to find out anytime soon. Now, there is one other way to get it, potentially. Some doctors are also able to order genetic tests, which may or may not be as expansive with as many different genes looked at as the ones you get from these online companies. And you could, in theory, take whatever data you get from your doctor and input it into a site like Fitness Genes for analysis. There are several other sites that seem to offer just analysis and not testing. If you go this route, insurance may or may not cover this kind of test, depending on if it's considered elective, if your doctor can find a reason to order it. So your cost could be, honestly, anything. Our healthcare system right now, it's impossible to even take a stab at it. So just know that's potentially an option you can talk about with a doctor. If you really, really want to do a genetic test to see if you have an FTO risk variant or two, these are all options. Just keep in mind that there are some definite pros and cons to doing these testing sites or trying to go through your doctor, and that you may or may not find out as much as you want to know. And then also keep in mind that even if you get your feedback back and it says, yes, you have the single risk variant for FTO, or you have the double variant, or any of the other genes associated with weight gain that you might find. Genetics aren't the only factor. Remember, environment still plays a key role, especially as linked with genetics. In particular, the other ones all are factors, but those two seem to especially go hand in hand, which is why I'm covering them first, 1 and 2, because they are tied so closely together. So, as I said, that will be the next one. We'll talk about that in the next episode. And of course, there are all of those other factors too. We talked about stress, we talked about sleep, we talked about how much you exercise, we talked about how things are marketed to you, which also ties into environment. You know, if there's a giant McDonald's sign right across the street from your house. I mean, you're going to see that every day. You're going to have McDonald's on your mind all the time. And again, genetics is a part in that it can come from your parents, but also environment can come from your parents, but also genetics. Also, genetics can have things that you don't see in your parents. As they said, they did studies with twins and seeing where one twin is thin and one twin is obese. And in theory, they should have identical genes, or they should have close to identical genes if they're not identical twins. And they should have the same environment. All of that other stuff should be the same. But they have found where one is fat and one is thin. And it ties into, yes, your genetics, but also what your genetics do to the hormones in your body, and how that affects your body's chemistry and your brain's chemistry. So it's not just quite as simple as saying, oh yes, I have this genetic variant for blah, 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 for FTO or for any of the others. You know, you can be genetically predisposed towards diabetes. You know, that doesn't mean you have diabetes, but it can affect how your body processes sugar, maybe. It can have further effects beyond just, oh, I have this, therefore I will be obese, or oh, I have this, therefore I will have hormone problems. It's really the kind of thing that you have to keep a very open mind about when you look at, if you do this kind of genetic testing and you're looking at the results, is that keeping in mind that knowing you have this thing doesn't just automatically fix. It just is an indicator to you of what might be happening inside your brain or inside your body, that you can then incorporate into your eating plan, your lowercase d diet, because if you have something working against you, you need to incorporate that. If, for example, your brain chemistry is such that you will overindulge on sweet foods, you need to limit your sweet foods knowing that you will eat more of them. Does that make sense? So it's not a do this test, find out all the answers. It's a now I have to analyze it and see how this will affect me, and therefore incorporate that into what plan I make for eating. So, very long disclaimer about I never said this genetic test will solve all your problems. So, yes, that has been genetic factors in making you gain weight and how you can potentially test for them. As I said, next time we will be talking more about environment, more than we did today, and just how it combines with genetics. We will probably also touch on genetics again, because again, those two are really closely intertwined. And then as the week progresses, and next week, we will talk about the other factors from those two lists. You will see those two lists repeating. I actually will probably smoosh them into one list. So we'll have one pretty little list graphic. So, that being said, as always, I am your host, Roly Poly, as always, and this has been Roly Poly Weight Loss. Use the hashtag Roly Poly to share your experiences. If you have done a test and found out that you have genetic markers like FTO variants, how has that impacted your weight loss plan? Can you clarify in any way what information you get from these companies without sharing any of your sensitive data, but just clarifying what kind of things they give you? Because again, they are very, very loath to share information. So if you can share and tell the rest of us what kind of stuff they gave you, if it was very clear, or if you did have to use one of those online companies that interprets your data for you, that would be great. Help us out, because I found it very hard to get information on them. So again, share your results in as much as you would like to. Share your strategies.
Activity completed.
And that is it for the day. And we completed it. All right, please join me next time.